Let's start the recording. Thank you everyone for coming this evening. My name's Donna Stewart and I would like to welcome you to Take Part's monthly event for November. We are thrilled to have Mr. Gregory Nokes with us this evening, as well as Mr. Malik Bell. To tell you just a little bit about Take Part, the mission of Take Part is to confront racism and engage in dismantling the systems that perpetuate ingrained racial inequality. We do this through events, education, and outreach that foster engagement in building community where all people are treated with equality and respect. The views, thoughts, and opinions in the presentations at Take Part events do not necessarily represent those of Take Part and do not constitute an endorsement.
Try your arrows.
Yes, I am having a minor technical difficulty here. Okay. We spent all that time worrying about Mr. Nokes being able to share his slides, and here I am having trouble sharing mine. Okay, I got the next one. Okay, resume. I'm going to ask you all to bear with me on this view. So these are just our technical things. Attendees will remain muted until the question and answer period. During the presentation, please use the chat button found at the bottom of your screen. That is where you can put in some questions. You can ask for information. You will also see messages from us in the chat box. If you would like to ask a question, and that means like if you would like to use your voice to ask a question, please wait until the question and answer portion. We will be inviting you to ask questions later. You can click on the participants button at the bottom of your screen and use the raise hand feature to the right. The host will unmute you when you're called on. And please, of course, keep your comments and questions concise and respectful. We have a few communication agreements that we like to go over when we have our events. First is to listen more, and listen even when you're feeling uncomfortable. Engage tension, but don't indulge drama. Wait, why am I talking? That's one that I usually need reminded about. Consultation and collaboration and not competition. Nobody's here to win an argument. So what we're here to do is consult and collaborate and learn together. And finally, confidentiality. Please take away the ideas and the learning, but leave the details that are specific to everybody else who's here. This event is made possible in part by the local spiritual assembly of the Baha'is of Portland and by contributions from individual donors like you, and we really, really appreciate your support. We're here tonight with Mr. Gregory Nokes, who wrote Breaking Chains, Slavery on Trial in the Oregon Territory. And we are joined by Mr. Malik Bell, who we're very excited to have as well. We do want to let you know that Mr. Nokes' book, Breaking Chains, is available right now for 30% off, also with free shipping. And we are going to be putting the link in the chat box for you to where you can go and purchase that from OSU Press. And finally, it is my great pleasure to introduce Mr. Malik Bell. He is our moderator this evening. Malik has an extensive background in public service, financial technology, and education. He writes and is published regularly in these areas. Malik is a graduate of Boston College, has been married for 20 years, has 2 children, and currently resides in Maui, Hawaii, where he runs educational support programs through the University of Hawaii, Maui College. I will turn it over to you, Malik. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Donna. That's too kind and too good introduction. Well, thank you to everyone, and thank you particularly to Take Part Portland anti-racism team for having me in what is sure to be an engaging and thoughtful presentation. I have the tremendous honor of introducing our featured speaker for tonight, Mr. Gregory Nokes. And I'll just say a few words about him prior to his presentation. Greg has had a career in journalism that spans over 40 years. He's written for The Oregonian, The Associated Press, has been stationed in New York, San Juan, Buenos Aires, Washington, D.C. as a diplomatic and economics correspondent. He has also traveled to over 50 countries. Greg will give a presentation of his acclaimed work, Breaking the Chains, Slavery on Trial in the Oregon Territory. And currently Greg lives in Westland, Oregon with his wife, Candace. Please join me in welcoming Greg Nokes.
Thank you, Malik. I appreciate that kind introduction. It's wonderful to be here with all the park folks tonight, and thank you all for coming. I'm going to start out by reading an introduction to my book, which will sort of set the stage for everything that follows. So this is the book, Breaking Chains, Slavery on Trial in the Washington Territory, or Oregon Territory. So here's the prologue. I owe an apology to Billy Taylor. It's not his real name, of course. Too much time has gone by for me to remember that. I believe he came from Virginia, but I'm not sure of that either. It was someplace in the South. Billy had come to Portland to spend a summer with his grandparents. They lived on the corner of Everett Street and 32nd Avenue, a half block down Everett from where I lived. Billy was a friendly kid, lanky, sandy hair, a big grin, 12 or so, same as me. We became instant friends for a time, not best friends, but friends. However, in the year just ended at Laurelhurst Grade School, I'd been taught a brief history of slavery in the Civil War. An oversimplified narrative I interpreted as follows. North good, South bad, North fighting to free slaves, South fighting to keep slaves. Of course, in my all-white neighborhood in virtually all-white Portland, there was but a single African American in our school. I had no idea how the North treated Blacks. I do recall my sole Black classmate, whom I didn't get to know very well, would occasionally come to school in a sweater with holes in it. A kid who didn't have holes in his sweaters remembers things like that. But back to Billy. For some reason, which I don't recall, another neighborhood chum and I turned on Billy one day, and he became for us a contrived enemy. We used his Southern background as a weapon, accusing him of supporting slavery in the Confederacy. We began calling him a Reb, which wasn't so bad, but the name calling soon got uglier. We taunted him. We refused to play with him. I hate to think we might even have thrown dirt clods at him once. There was one particularly sad afternoon, possibly the last time I saw Billy, when he left us in tears, head down, walking along 32nd Avenue back toward his grandparents' home, with us yelling and laughingly calling him names. Kids can be cruel. No news there, but no excuse either. I guess that was one kid who never wanted to return to our city of roses. What I didn't know then, but I now know, is that we in Oregon had no reason to be smug about our attitudes and policies toward African Americans and other minorities. Indeed, our own history is shameful. Witness, many of our early leaders were pro-slavery. Serious debate was given to whether Oregon should become a slave state. There were slaves in Oregon, and no one seemed to care much. Most of those who opposed slavery in the early years did so largely for economic reasons. Moral reasons were an afterthought. Consider also the great shame of our Black exclusion laws. Bad enough that a Black exclusion clause was written into Oregon's Constitution in 1857. Worse, that it wasn't removed until 1926. Moreover, I've faced personal regret on recently learning that a distant ancestor brought a slave to Oregon. Ask any school teacher about our past sympathies and flirtations with slavery, you are likely to get a blank stare. Ask residents of liberal Lane County if they know of the pro-slavery background of one of Oregon's first US senators, Joseph Lane, for whom the county was named in 1851. Who remembers today that members of the Oregon delegation to the 1860 Democratic National Convention walked out in solidarity with delegates from slave states? Few may know that Joseph Lane ran for vice president in 1860 on a secessionist ticket with John Breckinridge of South Carolina against Abraham Lincoln. If I were in school again, I would want to understand the real history of our state, not a sanitized version that misleads us into myths and misplaced self-satisfaction. We can learn from our past. We should. My intention with this book is to penetrate some of the myths we have about our heritage as it relates to slavery and our attitudes toward and treatment of people of color. We were not untainted by everything that slavery represented. Yes, we declared ourselves early on as opposed to slavery, but we also declared ourselves early on as opposed to having African Americans among us. This book will try to explain how these two positions were related and to show that we in the Pacific Northwest were very much a part of the national turmoil and debate over slavery. We had our own serious flirtation with the dark side of our nation's history. We were part of the problem. Billy, if you ever chance to read this, you will remember the pain I caused on those summer afternoons. Kids don't forget things like that. I want to talk a little bit how I got into this story. I'm not the only one who's explored this subject in Oregon, obviously. I had written a book called Massacred for Gold about the Chinese in the Northwest, and they had their own issues of being discriminated against. And it was very well received. It was published by Oregon State University Press, as is my book on Oregon slavery. And I wanted to write another book because this one was so successful. The Massacred for Gold was. So I talked to my brother Bill one day and I bounced several ideas off of him. And he said, oh, that's all well and good, but why don't you write about Reuben Shipley? I said, who was Reuben Shipley? He said, he was a slave brought to Oregon by one of our ancestors. I had no idea at that point. I had no idea there had ever been slaves in Oregon. There were. I had no idea that the family was ever involved with slavery. It was. So I decided to explore that subject, and that became the subject of my book. I asked Bill how he knew about this family history, and he said, well, you go to the family genealogy, and you look on page 359, and you will find, this is a pretty thick book, 1,400 pages. I'd never read the darn thing, although it had it on my bookshelf for years, but apparently my brother had. And there is a story in there that I want to read in just a moment. The story is of Reuben Shipley, a slave brought to Oregon from Missouri, like I said, by one of our ancestors. I'm now going to try and start the slides. Let's see if I can successfully do that. I'm going to share screen. I'm going to this item. Voila, so far so good. And I'd go back a little bit. So there's the book. So this is just the introduction to this family genealogy. My dear grandparents, Minnie and Will Junkin, had written this genealogy. They'd gone way back to Germany to start with our German ancestors who came to this country in the 1700s. But Minnie Junkin on the left came out with the Hinkle family to Oregon in a wagon train in 1853. And it's this family that I'm dealing with in that story. So on page, and Minnie and my grandparents, dear grandparents, had actually written this book. That it was a life's work for them to do all this, traveling around the world. Anyway, on page 359, they write as follows. They're talking about a Thomas Shipley, a white Shipley in Missouri. He also brought a slave known as Uncle Reuben Shipley, who was buried in the Mount Union Cemetery near Corvallis, Oregon, as R.E. Ficklin. His owner promised him his freedom if he would come to Oregon and help them get settled. This promise or agreement was fulfilled, and the slave known as Uncle Reuben Shipley settled also in Benton County. He is buried in Mount Union Cemetery, 4 miles west of Corvallis, Oregon, probably under his true name, R.E. Ficklin, together with his own family. Uncle Reuben gave the original tract of land for Mount Union Cemetery. The cemetery is often called the Newton Cemetery, etc., etc. Uncle Reuben's wife was also a former slave of another settler, and he was required to purchase her freedom. So without my dear grandparents, I would never have known that story and never have been able to write the book. So I'm very beholden to them, and I dedicate the book to them. Uh-oh, how come this isn't advancing? It's not advancing.
That's the same problem that I had. And what I ended up doing is pausing the share and restarting the share.
Stop share, okay.
Mm-hmm.
And restarting the share. Okay, seems like are you seeing the slides now?
Not yet.
Okay, we're just got to go back to square one here some way. Okay. I have to figure out how to do this to share again here. Share screen, see what happens here. Keep your fingers crossed, folks. Okay, the racism started early in Oregon and seldom was far away. This is Peter Burnett, who was led the first major wagon train to Oregon in 1843, brought about 1,000 white settlers out, who at that time more than doubled the white population in Oregon. It was known as the Great Migration, brought a couple of slaves out. Burnett himself who was born in Tennessee, owned slaves and came from a major slave owning family. We do know that he brought at least one slave because the record of that wagon train shows that that young girl drowned in the Columbia River, but he probably brought another one as well to help him get his farm started. Burnett had had a career even before he came to Oregon. He was a self-taught attorney in Missouri and defended Mormon leader Joseph Smith following the Mormon War in Missouri in 1837, I think, something like that. Anyway, he led the first major wagon train out to Oregon. He got himself elected to the Legislative Council, which was the first government of Oregon. And on that government, boy, this is not working right here. Donna, I'm stuck. I don't know what to do here. Here we go. Okay. So you'll see on the left the Legislative Hall in Oregon City, and that's the wagon trains in that period, as most people know, stopped in Oregon City, and it became the seat of the new government of Oregon, which was organized in 1843. When Burnett arrived in 1844, being a major player and a mover and shaker, he got himself elected to the Legislative Council and very quickly enacted some pro-slavery legislation. In 1843, the very first organizers of Oregon's fledgling government who met down in the Willamette Valley, they passed a law flatly banning slavery in Oregon. That didn't work for Burnett and a couple of other people that came with him. I should point out that almost every wagon train in those early years, beginning with the one that came in 1844, had a few slaves attached to the wagon train. Most of the settlers that came to Oregon were opposed to slavery, but there were a few who brought slaves with them. And there were so few that nobody seemed to care much, and we'll get into that. Anyway, Burnett and his friends, several of them did bring slaves. He was head of the wagon train, and he got himself elected to the legislative council, ran the council, and passed what became an exclusion law, which I can't quite, I can move it screen over here, shoot. I can't read it because of these windows that are up there. But anyway, basically, it provides that if any Negro or mulatto who came to Oregon in that period would have to leave within 3 years, and if arrested upon a warrant, they would be subject to severe lashing of not less than 12 or more than 25 lashes. But it also provided that they could be, if they were brought as slaves, that was okay if they would have to be released in 2 or 3 years. Is there a way to get rid of this window up here? It will help me a lot. Donna, do you know?
Are you seeing a window with?
There, I got rid of it. Maybe you're not. Are you seeing me still?
Yes.
Okay, all right. So here we go. All right. So anyway, this lash law in the 1844 Exclusion Act provided that somebody could bring a slave and keep them for up to 3 years. And then after 3 years would have to be set free. And then that free Negro or mulatto would have to leave Oregon in that period of time or be subject to this severe punishing. It's not clear anybody was punished under this act because it was changed the following year. But one thing to remember is for a very brief period in 1844 and 1845, slavery was actually lawful in Oregon. I have a cheat sheet here I need to consult here from time to time, so forgive me for looking down here. Well, one thing that I didn't mention when I was showing the picture of my grandparents, I'm probably one of the few people alive today who actually met somebody who came across on the Oregon Trail. This was an aunt of mine, Rachel Ann Henkel Shipley, who died in when she was 103, and she came across in the 1853 wagon train, which I'll get to in a minute. But I was just a small boy when I met her, but I can still remember her. And she was a dear lady, I understand. Why don't I, gosh.
Greg, in the bottom left-hand corner, you see the arrows on your slide. Try using those.
Thank you, it works. So hopefully I'll be a little more smooth from now on this. So Reuben Shipley, who was a slave brought to Oregon by one of our ancestors, ended up in Oregon, and he eventually got his freedom, probably fairly soon after. And I'll tell his story a little bit later, but right now I'm going to shift to the only slavery trial that there ever was in Oregon. And I was amazed that there ever was a slavery trial. So what we're looking at now in that red line is the Oregon Trail, approximately 1844, 1845 in that period. And you see in Missouri, on the far right, Fayette, Missouri. And there was a fellow there, a local sheriff, major slave owner named Nathaniel Ford. And in the late 1830s, the economy in Missouri and much of the rest of the country had gone into a depression. And so property owners in Missouri heard of this free land out in Oregon. And so many of them packed up and came to Oregon. That really started what became the emigration to Oregon on the Oregon Trail. And several of them brought slaves, including Nathaniel Ford. Nathaniel Ford brought 6 slaves, more than any other individual that we know of. There was Robin and Polly Holmes, a couple, and 3 of their children, and an adult slave named Scott. And they settled in Polk County. Nathaniel Ford had been a big player in Missouri, a major property owner, had been a county sheriff in Fayette County, served in the Missouri legislature 1 term. And he arrived in Oregon in 1844 and became a major player in Oregon, served 4 terms in the provisional and territorial legislatures. But where the story becomes important is that in 1852, he was sued by his former slave, Robin Holmes, in what became Oregon's only slavery trial. To step back just a bit in that story, when gold was discovered in California in 1848, Nathaniel Ford wanted his share. About 2/3 of Oregon's small population that had gone to California to mine gold. And those folks who had slaves like Nathaniel Ford wanted their adult slaves to go to California too and mine gold. And so Ford sent Scott and Robin Holmes to California to mine gold for him, with the understanding that they would get, in return, they would get their freedom when they came back. Scott died, unfortunately, on the way back to Oregon, but Robin Holmes did come back with gold and was set free. And his wife, Polly, was set free. But Nathaniel Ford kept their children. They'd come across the plains with 3 children who were fairly young in that period. And Ford's argument was, well, I fed them and clothed them and brought to Oregon, paid all their expenses. Now I'm entitled to the service of their labor until they get older. And so that didn't go down well with Robin Holmes, who was obviously a very brave, forthright individual. And so he sued Robin Holmes or Nathaniel Ford from the freedom of his children. I'm going to read just a little bit from that part of the book. Well, I should say that Ford and his family and his slaves had settled in what is today Rick Rial, Oregon, and virtually the entire town of Rick Rial is on what was once Nathaniel Ford's donation land claim. It was a farm area, and he had his slaves obviously helping him develop his farm down there. And this is the house that Ford had. I got this photograph from the Oregon Historical Society, and you can see at the top it says Ford House at Ellendale, which is now a with slave quarters, and the slave quarters would be in the back here. And so that was where the Holmes family obviously was living. This was probably not the first house that Ford had. It's quite a nice looking home. He probably had other houses first. Ellendale's now a ghost town. But anyway, Ford kept Holmes' children after setting Holmes and Polly free, and Holmes sued him. How Holmes came to file his suit is a matter of conjecture. Was he encouraged by a friend, a neighbor, perhaps someone who had witnessed his despair? At the time of Holmes' suit, there were no laws in Oregon prohibiting African Americans from filing a lawsuit or testifying in court against whites. That was soon to change as a result of this suit. And blacks were banned from filing suit against whites, but not at this time. We know Holmes was someone who stood up for himself and his family, but think of the odds. He had lived his life as a slave, raised in a slave culture, bought and sold at the whim of others, unable to read or write. He was up against a powerful man with powerful connections, recently elected to the territorial legislature. Yet, despite all, Holmes was a risk taker. This would be evident again years later when he and his wife would be among a handful of African Americans, all former slaves who integrated a white church in Salem. That's the Salem Congregational Church. This is a very important part of their history. Prior to bringing a suit, Holmes had had several angry exchanges with Ford over custody of Holmes' children. Now, a bit of conjecture I do here. Most likely these occurred at Ford's home. We don't know what was said, but we might guess how they started. Did Holmes arrive on foot or by wagon to confront Ford, who after a shouting match ordered Holmes to leave? Was it during one of these arguments that Ford threatened to seize the entire Holmes family under the new Fugitive Slave Act and return them to slavery in Missouri? We know that because that came out during the trial, court hearing. Did Holmes go in anger and frustration directly from Ford's home into the Polk County Courthouse, a new 2-story wood building in Dallas, and enter unannounced into the prosecuting attorney's office to seek help? If so, he may well have been greeted with curiosity, even suspicion. Here was a black man, possibly ill-dressed in work clothes, covered with dust from the grist mill where Holmes had found work, unable to write his own name and probably knowing little or nothing about legal procedures. One can imagine the clerk trying to shoo him away, ignoring the man's simple plea to help him get his children back. Someone then or earlier did take him in hand. That someone was Reuben Boyce, the prosecuting attorney for the Oregon Territory. A native of Massachusetts and a graduate of Williams College, Boyce arrived in Oregon by ship in 1851. After briefly practicing law in Portland, he settled on a donation land claim at Nesmith Mills, very near where Holmes worked. It would be easy to romanticize a possible scene in Boyce's office. While sitting at his desk on a warm afternoon in early spring, he hears Holmes pleading for help and resisting the clerk's attempts to get him to leave. At 31 years of age, Boyce is new in his position, appointed prosecuting attorney only weeks earlier by the territorial legislature. He is from Massachusetts, a hotbed of abolitionist sentiment. This could be his first case, an important one. No slavery case has yet come before Oregon's territorial courts, nor would there be ever be another one. He lives within 10 miles of Ford's farm and no doubt knows who Ford is. Perhaps he doesn't care for him because he is a slave owner. Whatever it is that motivates him, he asks Holmes to come in and sit down. All that could be true, some of it true, maybe none of it true. Boyce could have met Holmes at James Nesmith's gristmill, where Holmes worked as a laborer. Perhaps Nesmith, out of sympathy for Holmes' plight, mentioned him to Boyce. But what is certainly true is that something or someone did bring Boyce and Holmes together, and Boyce took charge of his case. The case dragged on for 5 months before 4 different judges. The first 3 judges were judges appointed, all the judges in Oregon at that time were appointed by presidents in the East. Oregon was still in territorial status in that period. And most of the appointed judges were from the South. And many of the leaders in Oregon were themselves Southerners, either pro-slavery, some had been slaveholders before they got to Oregon. So it was really controversial to try and to counter what was a prevailing sentiment among many leaders. But a new territorial Supreme Court justice had been appointed by President Pierce, who was not a slaveholder, came from the North, and he appointed George Williams to be the new territorial Supreme Court judge of Oregon, and he took over the Holmes versus Ford case. And you can see that George Williams was, he went on to be a U.S. Senator and was a U.S. Attorney General under Ulysses Grant. But Judge Williams would refer in later years to negative fallout from his ruling, saying it probably prevented him from being elected one of Oregon's first senators after statehood in 1859, although he eventually was elected a senator. In an address to the Oregon Legislative Assembly on the 40th anniversary of statehood, Williams left no doubt of his own feelings about the significance of his ruling. Whether or not slaveholders could carry their slaves into the territories and hold them there as property had become a burning question, and I'm quoting from his ruling. And my predecessors in office, for reasons best known to themselves, had declined to hear the case. This was among the first cases I was called upon to decide. Mr. Ford contended that these colored people were his property in Missouri, from which he emigrated, and he had as much right to bring that kind of property into Oregon and hold it here as much as he had to bring his cattle or other property here and hold it as such. But my opinion was, and I so held, that without some positive legislative enactment establishing slavery here, it did not and could not exist in Oregon, and I awarded the colored people their freedom. So far as I know, this was the last effort made to hold slaves in Oregon by force of law. There were a great many virulent pro-slavery men in the territory, and this decision, of course, was very distasteful to them. As I said, Williams went on to national prominence as a U.S. Attorney General in that period. Oh boy. We have picture, only one photograph of anyone in the Shipley family. Reuben Shipley was a father, and he had several, or Robin, excuse me. Robin Holmes and Polly Holmes were the slave couple brought to Oregon by Nathaniel Ford. One of their 3 children. We have only this picture of Mary Jane Holmes Shipley. And I will come back to her story a little bit later, but just leave it here in this period to say she eventually married Reuben Shipley, who was a former slave brought by one of my ancestors. And for her hand, Ford demanded, even though she had been freed by the court by George Williams' ruling, Ford still demanded that her new husband, Reuben Shipley, pay him $800 for expenses for having purchased her. And this photo was taken in 1924, shortly before her death. This is the courthouse in Salem, Oregon, a sketch of the courthouse where Oregon's Constitutional Convention was held in 1857. Oregon was getting ready to become a state. And there was nothing, as the delegates met in the courthouse to plan a constitution for Oregon, there was no issue more important to them than whether Oregon would become a slave state. And these are some of the quotes from that period. George Williams, who had made that ruling, was taking a stand against slavery, obviously. And so on the eve of the convention, there was all this sentiment for slavery, whether the Constitution was going to approve slavery or not. And this was a debate running up to the convention. And Judge Williams wrote what became the Free State Letter, which was a very famous letter. It ran all over the page 1 of the Salem Statesman in Salem, Oregon on July 18, 1857, shortly before the Constitutional Convention was to be held. And it would be a more famous letter, except the argument he used was that blacks were a drag on the economy. And if slavery was improved, it would destroy the economy of Oregon. And it was an ugly letter tinged with racism. So while it persuaded people to vote against slavery, it's not something that anybody held up as being a firm statement for emancipation or for human rights. And historian Walter Carleton Woodward, writing in 1910, said, as pro-slavery sentiment had up to this time been steadily rising, from the publication of the Free State Letter onto the election in November, it seemed steadily to recede. And as you can see in Williams' letter included, I know what siren song self-love sings for slavery, how pleasant it seems in prospect to have a slave to till our ground, to wait upon us while we wake and fan us when we sleep. But establish slavery here and the effect will be as it has elsewhere. You will turn aside that tide of free white labor which has poured itself like a fertilizing flood across the great states of Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, and is now murmuring up the eastern slope of the Rocky Mountains. And some of the wording was even uglier. And later on, Williams said, I had to write the letter that way because I had to write it in a way that it would convince Oregonians who were really interested in the economic argument, had no interest in a human rights argument. So that's how he defended some of the ugliness that he wrote about. The president of the convention was Matthew P. Deedy. And those of you who follow the news in Oregon probably know that Deedy's name was recently removed from the University of Oregon Law School. He was the founder of the University of Oregon Law School. And a couple of years ago, there was a move to eliminate his name, and the powers that be down at the University of Oregon decided to keep it because he had helped to found the law school. And so he had been a distinguished jurist, quote unquote, in Oregon. But the Black Lives Matter movement of this year has caused rethinking of that. So they have taken his name off of the University of Oregon Law School. And I don't think they've renamed it anything yet, but that's coming up there. They'll come up with something soon. Anyway, Deedy arrived in Oregon in 1849. He was a relatively poor man when he came here, became self-taught. And you can see from this slide, he was president of the 1857 Oregon Constitutional Convention, appointed by President Pierce as a US District Judge in 1859. That came a little bit later. But on the eve of the convention, he made clear his views about slavery. If a citizen of Virginia can lawfully own a Negro, of which there is no doubt, then I, as a citizen of Oregon, can lawfully obtain the same right of property in this Negro by either purchase or inheritance. So this was the issue in the Constitutional Convention. And just to continue the reflection of that pro-slavery sentiment or the anti-Black sentiment in the period, this is Lafayette Grover, a future governor, who in 1857, and again on the eve of the convention, said, "I am one of those who believe that the government of the United States is a government of white men, but the Declaration of Independence was a declaration of the equality and natural free citizenship of white men." This was the, Jesse Applegate was one of the few who addressed the issue of slavery on the question of human rights. I've written a separate book is coming out later this year called Eminent Oregonian, just being published by Oregon State University Press. And I've written a section on Jesse Applegate because of his role in opposing slavery in Oregon. He came out on the same wagon train with Peter Burnett, also one of the wagon train captains along with Burnett in that period. And he developed the Applegate Trail, for which he's known, an alternative trail into Oregon, but he really should be better known for his opposition to slavery. So on the first day of the convention, let me get the date here right. It was August 18th, 1857. He spoke immediately at the opening of the convention. "The discussion of the subject of slavery by this body is out of place and uncalled for, and only calculated to engender bitter feelings among the members of the body, destroy its harmony, retard its business, and necessarily prolong its session." He feared that the pro-slavery sentiment in the convention would result in a pro-slavery clause in the Constitution, so he didn't want to discuss it all, but it was discussed anyway. We'll come back to Applegate a bit later. Here's just a sampling of the debate that went on in the convention over the issue of slavery. It was the issue. Thomas Dreyer, Multnomah County: "The people sent us up here to discuss the question and submit it to them for a decision. The question of slavery is the all-important question in Oregon now." Delazon Smith, Lynn County, a future US Senator: "Hundreds in the county were for a free state if free Negroes were kept out of the state. But if we were to have Negroes at all, let them be slaves." Erasmus Shattuck, Washington County: "It should be known to our children whether they live under a free or slave state constitution. I go a free state and I wish that to be understood." A.J. Lovejoy, Clackamas County: "You can't keep this Negro question out. It will come up in some shape and the convention has got to meet it." Well, the convention kicked the can down the road. It didn't decide. And the question was put to a public vote. Well, keep in mind this, the pro-slavery sentiment had been building up before the convention held. Judge Williams' Free State letter had received major attention. It became persuasive an economic argument that slavery would not work in Oregon. And so the result was overwhelmingly against slavery. The vote that time was all by white men, white males, I should say, and it was a public vote. They voted in public in front of a elector, I guess you would say. Anyway, the vote for slavery was 26-45 and overwhelmingly against slavery, 7,727. But they also submitted a clause to the Constitution banning free Negroes in Oregon, and that passed overwhelmingly for exclusion, 8,640 against exclusion, 1,081. And that clause read, No free Negro or mulatto not residing in this state at the time of the adoption of this Constitution shall come, reside, or be within this state, or hold any real estate, or make any contracts, or maintain any suit therein in the Legislative Assembly, shall provide by penal laws for the removal by public officers of all such Negroes and mulattoes, and for their effectual exclusion from the state, and for the punishment of persons who shall bring them into the state, or employ or harbor them. I have 10 minutes to 8. How much time do I have to still to talk? Does somebody help me on that? Guess not, so I just keep going.
I think it's, you probably have another maybe 5 minutes or so that you can get some great questions and have
okay. All right, because I've got a lot to go here, so we'll just put it off. This is Joseph Lane. Lane County is named for him. He was Oregon's first territorial governor, a US senator. And when I was a kid, I heard Joseph Lane of Oregon ran for vice president. Wow, that's a pretty good deal. A guy from Oregon ran for vice president, even though he didn't win. What I didn't know is he ran on a slave state ticket with John Breckinridge against Abraham Lincoln. So he was very much a pro-slavery official in Oregon. So I'm going to go on and get to one fellow who did oppose slavery on the basis of human rights was Obed Dickinson of the Salem Congregational Church. Obviously, that's a newer version of what was a church then. Obed was eventually kicked out of his office as minister because people didn't like his abolitionist stand. But he was one of the few, along with Jesse Applegate, who opposed slavery on the basis of human rights. This is a Mount Union Cemetery in Philomath, Oregon. And this is where many of my relatives are buried. This is where Reuben Shipley is buried, is with his wife, Mary Jane, who was a member of the Holmes family when they came. And Shipley, after he got his freedom, became a quite successful farmer. He had a 100-acre farm, even though African-Americans were banned by the Constitution from owning property in Oregon. He was still allowed in a kind of a sympathetic area of Oregon to have his own property, which he did. And so he and his wife donated land for a cemetery, which is a Mount Union Cemetery, which is still an active cemetery today. I have in my book in the a list of the slaves we know about. There's probably about 45 that I knew about when I wrote the book. We don't have much information on many of them. You can see I have them listed here, and this is not a complete list because I didn't do a great job on the slide, but you get some idea. We have a name, sometimes it's just a partial name. We may have know where they settled. We may know the year they came, we may not. In many cases, we don't know what happened to them. We do know a few of them because there was something stood out about them in Oregon history. And this is a slave marker, a grave marker down in Corvallis, Oregon at the Oddfellows Cemetery down there, an historic cemetery. And this just tells us that there was Amy, who was a slave of Mary and John Porter. We don't know very much about Amy. We do know that she was a slave of the Johnson and Susan Mulkeys and then was passed along to yet another family. But this told us something. She died in 1847. Well, she came to Oregon in 1847, and she died after abolition, after slavery was banned. But this marker tells us that, okay, slavery was unlawful, and yet nobody cared. And so the family had no compunction against listing her as a slave to the family. But it also tells you she was treated with respect, because very few African-American slaves or otherwise in Oregon had their own grave marker. So she was obviously treated with respect despite her slave status. This is America Waldo, third from the right. And she came out as a young slave, brought either by Daniel Waldo of Oregon historic fame or his brother, and married third from the left, Richard Bogle, who was a free Black from Jamaica. He made money as a farmer and a barber up in the Walla Walla, Washington area, and they had quite a family. And there's an interesting story I tell about white Waldos and the black Waldos that I can't get into now, but quite a controversy between how the families started. This is Amanda Gardner Johnson, who came to Oregon and married. She was a former slave. And I've got to read one more thing, and then I'm going to end it here. As I said at the outset, I was not the first person to write about slavery in Oregon. There was a fellow in the 1920s, a journalist named Fred Lockley of the Oregon Journal, who actually interviewed some of the slaves before they passed away. Fred wrote a number of newspaper articles about them, but nobody picked up on it. When Fred died, the story kind of died with him. But I found Fred's work at the Oregon Historical Society, and I give him full credit in my book for what he did. So he wrote about Amanda Gardner Johnson. Amanda Johnson was born in Liberty, Clay County, Missouri, August 30, 1833, and arrived in Oregon in 1853 with the Anderson Deckard family. In an interview from her home in Albany in 1921, Johnson told journalist Fred Lockley that although a slave, she was proud she had never been bought or sold. And Lockley wrote this: "When I asked her if she had ever been sold as a slave, she said, 'No, sir, I was never sold nor bartered for. I was given as a wedding present to my owner's daughter. I belonged to Mrs. Nancy Wilhite. Mrs. Wilhite later married Mr. Coram. When her daughter, Miss Lydia, was married, she gave me to her as a wedding present.'" Excuse me. "I have known 7 generations of the family. I had 5 brothers and 6 sisters. None of us were sold like common Negroes. We were all given away as the different young folks got married. In 1853, my owners came to Oregon. A man offered my master $1,200 for me. I was 19 years old then. My owner said, 'Amanda isn't for sale. She is going across the plains to Willamette Valley with us. She is like one of the family. I don't care to sell her.' It took us 6 months to come from Liberty, Missouri to Oregon City. We reached our destination on September 13, 1853. Lou Southworth, also a slave, crossed the plains the same year I did. So did Benjamin Johnson, another slave, who later became my husband. Amanda Johnson said Deckard offered to free her if she wanted to stay in Missouri, but she explained to Lockley she was afraid. The word of a Negro, even if a free Negro, was of no value in court. Any bad white man could claim I had been stolen from him and could swear me into jail. Then in place of keeping me in jail, he could buy my services for the time I was sentenced for and do whatever he wanted to me. For Negroes were the same as cows and horses. We're not supposed to have morals or souls. I was afraid to accept my liberty, and so I came to Oregon with my owners." And so I'm going to end it there, except to add that Oregon had 3 exclusion laws during its history. There was one in 1844, which was changed in 1845. This was the one that what's his name, Jesse Applegate changed in 1845. And there was another one in 1847, which lasted until about 1853. And then there's another one that was in the Oregon Constitution in 1857 that was not changed until 1926. And so Oregon has always been a pretty white state, and there's several reasons for that. But one is that from the founding of Oregon, Blacks were told in a number of ways that they weren't welcome here. And that was one of the reasons why it has long been one of the whitest places in the United States. So I'm going to end my presentation there and stop my share and open this up for questions.
Well, thank you, Greg. That was a wonderful, well, I'll say this. Anybody who has read the book understands that these are the critical elements of the book that Greg has chosen to share with us for the purposes of this presentation. The book itself is filled with wonderful narrative and wrapped in story, and gives you a much richer picture of this evolution of sort of the disposition of Oregonians toward the issue of enslaved Africans on the continent. And it's just a wonderful thing to have. I mean, any family or any person who perhaps is moving to Oregon or who lives in Oregon should certainly have this as a part of their libraries, just simply to know where they are and from what has descended, you know, in terms of policy and things like that in the state. And there is a question here in the, or at least in the chat bar here that is asking, is this in the K through 12 system? And I suggest, I would think that it's not, but this is something that you would certainly, I went to the Oregon public school system and did not learn in the history courses about the Oregon Trail or anything like that. So certainly not something that was available to young people in the 1970s, 80s, or maybe, I mean, perhaps there's no distilled version that you could give to kids right now, but I'll start us off with some questions here, and then we'll also take some other questions as they roll in. But indeed, thank you very much, Greg, for that insightful, informative presentation. I'm not sure that you know this, but Oregonians are pretty particular and proud of their history. They often disassociate Oregon in particular with the history of enslavement, and are also proud to tell me so, you know, and over the years I've experienced that. We approach work like yours open to learning, but also there's a paradoxical position in that people choose to sort of stick with a particular idea of a certain set of historical facts, as it were. And particularly white Americans struggle to reconcile more accurate narratives as they begin to emerge or as they begin to have to grapple with that. And so my greater question is, what would you hope that your book would do for an individual, particularly white Americans, who would read about their history, and what would be the outcome that you would like to have your readers walk away with?
Just dismantling the myth. The myths that we grew up with. I'm not against myths, but we have the whole Oregon Trail myths, you know, good pioneers, bad Native Americans. And then I've talked about the myth of Oregonians looking down on the South because that was where slavery was, and we had no part of that. And I would hope that it would help to educate people. I did make a push, and there was a push to get this into schools, but it became just a bridge too far. I was actually served on a committee to discuss this, and it just became, I felt like Sisyphus trying to push this rock up the hill to get people wanted to give it attention. And my events, my presentations, any number of school teachers will come and get the book, and many express interest and say, I'm going to take this back to my class, whether that's college or high school or even the upper grades in elementary school. So I hope that somehow would filter into the educational debate in Oregon, because like I say, some myths can be understood and can actually have a positive effect. But this one, that we're better than other people, it just shouldn't stand. And then, of course, by recognizing what we've done and what the history of, then we can do a better job in addressing it and being corrective in our policies and attitudes, if that helps.
No, it does. And in particular, this work was published in 2013. Yes, that was the first publication.
That's right.
All right. Is there, obviously we live in a time where these issues are present. We're being called to account for a history that we haven't reconciled. Particularly white Americans are having to sort of look back. Is there any reaction that you've experienced, that you've had to the book 7 years ago that might be different from how you're being perceived today? What do you see as the differences between your first sort of foray into this particular area versus now?
I don't know that there's been a big change. The book is sold well, but it's a sort of an academic history book, Northwest oriented. not really in schools. I think some school libraries, you can find it in school libraries. So in that sense, it really hasn't, well, I'm going to step back. Oregon Public Broadcasting did a program based on this book, Slavery in Oregon. And a lot of people watched it, and so I just understand it's being repeated periodically. People will call me, hey, your program was on OPB at midnight the other night or something like that. So I think it has had an effect. It hasn't played back a whole lot to me. Most of my friends and associates are people who are sympathetic to the real history of Oregon and understanding that. But it has been an eye-opener to a lot of people. I have no doubt it was an eye-opener to me as I began writing it and discovering a slavery trial, exclusion acts. You know, what happened? What was all this? Slavery, slaves in Oregon? Our ancestor brought a slave? I mean, these were all real revelations to me. And so I think that, like I say, the book is circulated pretty well. And so I think it probably does have an effect on individuals. But I also, Malik, if I may, I have, I cut short my slides, but I would have shown that in Washington State, there was a fellow named George Washington who came out he'd been freed before he was a slave, but he brought up by his owner, helped to establish a city of Centralia, Washington up there. There's a statue of him in the Centralia City Park and a big mural of him on the side of a bank building up there. And he's honored for the work that he's done. There's no recognition in Oregon for any of the Blacks of this period who came out. And I have been an advocate for some sort of a statue or memorial to the Blacks in early Oregon in this period that would be in the state capitol grounds, for example. I received a lot of blank stares on that, but finally the Oregon Historical Society got interested and said they would try and take it to the legislature and see what happens. Well, suddenly we've got all this turmoil, all this. So this is obviously probably not the time that it's going to happen. But I really think in Oregon, we should have, that would be a great place to have something that honored the early Blacks in Oregon who received so little recognition. You go into the state capitol and you see all the friezes all around that show the history and the scenes from early Oregon. There are no Black faces there. And yet Blacks did play an important role in Oregon, not just those who came as slaves, but they were fur traders. They helped to lead the wagon trains, and they played a very significant role in this region. I don't think it's been too underappreciated.
Yeah, you do this in your book very well. I mean, I just recall the issue of almost removal of two African individuals in Portland, and Frederick Douglass brought light to it, the attention to it, by saying, you know, even this grandiose idea of the West Territories or the Oregon Territory as a place where liberty could be achieved was not necessarily the case. And you also draw that distinction between Oregon and Washington, in that there was one individual who did leave and ended up going toward the Olympic Peninsula and becoming very successful and thus being an integral part of the fabric of that community, even financing the westward movement of white settlers toward the territory at some point. So becoming such a valuable asset is not something that you typically would see in Portland or in Oregon or any part of that. So yeah, there is a very, very stark contrast to even those two neighboring states in their perspective and acknowledging that there's history. So I appreciate what you do in your book there. I have a couple of questions here that are in the chat, and I want to get some of those too. And the first is, and this has been repeated a couple of times, to what degree were the exclusion laws enforced?
They were, there's two ways of looking at it. They're not widely enforced. There are instances where the exclusion law that was enacted in 1847 to, my year's right here, I wrote all this stuff down so I could be accurate about it. Well, never mind, 1847 to 1854, that 1849 to 1854, there was at least one fellow was forced out of Oregon, Jacob Vanderpool, who had opened a store in Oregon City, became quite successful. White competitor exercised the exclusion law against him. A court tried him and sent him out of Oregon. Understand he became fairly successful in California. So he landed on his feet. And there were orders for several other Blacks to also leave Oregon in this period. But sentiment was building up in the legislature. This is wrong. And you had Frederick Douglass, who was also active in this period, who was calling attention to what was going on in Oregon. So the legislature conveniently dropped the law. This fellow Reuben Boyce, who I talked about earlier, who had defended Robin Holmes in his case, or prosecuted the Robin Holmes slavery case, he became a Supreme Court justice in Oregon, quite prominent himself. But while serving in the legislature, he was directed to help to rewrite the Oregon Code, the Code of Laws, and he left the exclusion law out of the Code of Laws. And the legislature apparently didn't realize what they were doing, so they passed the Code of Laws without the Exclusion Act. And that then sort of ended the effort to force several other Blacks out of Oregon. So that's one way to look at it. Enforce in a mild way, not widely, but the key effect of it was to send a message to Blacks throughout the country that this law has existed in most of Oregon's early settlement, and Black, you will not be welcome here. I mean, that was the most important impact of the exclusion laws, not so much to force Blacks out, we're already here, but to prevent Blacks, from coming in.
Thank you for that. This actually kind of leads into another question here that is asking about policing, and the question is, how have the history of present day policing policing structures intertwined or been influenced by slavery and anti-Black legislation throughout Oregon's history? And knowing particularly that all policing is selective. I mean, there's no such thing as the ability to enforce and to be sort of present for all law breaking. And again, traditionally, Black bodies have been policed for specific reasons. And you point to that in your prior answer, but I'll leave it at that. This is the question of current day policing structures being influenced by sort of more antique policing structures or policing policies.
I don't think there's any doubt that has occurred. The thing that popped into my mind was Nathaniel Ford, who came out with his slaves. His son became the first I want to say U.S. Marshal in Oregon. So he enforced Oregon's laws while Ford had slaves, and that sort of suggested nobody really cared about slavery in that period. So if you have your history with people not really caring about slaves, and I guess if your police are being trained, and you have police cultures, right? You have fathers and sons, and people who become policemen generally come out of a culture that's been conducive, to support that person becoming an officer. That the attitudes which start in one generation, I think, carry on into other generations. And I think it's very difficult to change them in this period. I think it's important to try. I think, we can see the effort going on now to change those attitudes. I don't know if that really addresses your question or not, but.
No, I think that's good. To some, it's a straight line. I mean, obviously, there are some who are recipient of policing and have a clear understanding of how laws are enforced in order to predict and create certain outcomes, specifically for African and African Americans. And they don't emerge out of thin air, and so it makes it clear that the history being inhospitable and particularly prone to injuring Africans and African Americans, it's clear that this is a consistent theme throughout our history here.
Speaking to what you're saying, I didn't touch on sundown laws,
sure,
which affect Blacks directly, and you had police in towns throughout Oregon. You know, after sundown, blacks not welcome here. Those laws really weren't written down, but they were understood. There was a course taught at Oregon State where I lectured several years ago on sundown laws. I'm not sure it's still being taught there. But so you have basically police kind of showing blacks the city limits. You can't stay here, you know, or you're going to spend the night in jail. Well, that kind of attitude on the part of cops, that becomes part of the deep-seated structure of police, that blacks really aren't equal. They're not welcome. And so you're going to enforce your laws more against, or single them out for enforcement much more than you would with the whites in the community. Again, that's a rambling answer, but I hope I made myself clear.
No, that's a good one. There's another question that's kind of specific. It touches on another work, the book, The Negro Cowboy, and it argues that Owen Wister, the Virginian, erased Negroes from the West. Wasn't it George Fletcher who was the black cowboy who competed at the Pendleton Roundup?
That's right.
Were there other black cowboys we just don't know about?
That I don't know. I can't answer that. I do know the story of George Fletcher a little bit, how successful he was. I would get they probably were other black cowboys. Blacks were quite active in the Northwest as loners, as fur traders in that period. It was something the blacks could do successfully where nobody was hassling them. And they did become cowboys, and Fletcher's an example of that. So I wouldn't be surprised if there were other blacks there. In a place like Pendleton, you know, you probably had a tough time being treated with equally up there. You know, it's like almost anything else in that period. If you're black, playing baseball or football or whatever, as you're breaking in that in the door, so to speak, you're going to have a tough time, you know, in the beginning. Then after a while, like football, you're dominant. Almost everybody is black, and it's unusual almost to find a white player now. But I don't mean to overdo that. I'm sorry, I probably shouldn't even raise that. But the people who became the path breakers have a tough time. And George Fletcher clearly did. He was a path breaker among the rodeo riders. But I have no doubt there were others in that period.
Yeah, I mean, there are several stories and things, and you know, we grew up hearing about Bill Pickett and others who were perhaps more famous even nationally for their skills as cowboys. There are several other comments in the chat window here that basically indicate, yes, it's, you know, you can Google, you know, black cowboys and things of this nature. I mean, one of the wonders of the internet is that you have information that is credible, or at least researchable, at your fingertips. So if you had curiosity, then you could certainly do that. Now, you know, where that curiosity comes from, or getting that curiosity to come to surface, that's always, you know, somebody's, who knows how to stimulate that in an individual. Let's see, we have a couple other questions here. And you know, I have actually one other anecdotal comment, and that is, like, you know, I've lived in both Virginia, and it seems like it's come up a couple of times in your discussion, and Oregon. And, you know, I grew up in Oregon and had traveled to probably most of the major cities from, you know, Eastern Oregon, you know, Pendleton, LeGrand, Baker, you know, Portland, all the cities in Portland. And I can't say that you feel much different in either state, you know, even though, you know, Virginia being the seat and the capital of the Confederacy in that sense, you know, for Oregon to have the attitude that they are sort of holier than thou, or at least, you know, that's sort of the idea that you have this state that in and of itself, and a lot of states do this in general, have their own ideas, high-minded ideas about themselves in general. But I tend to agree that it's an unearned position in that sense. And it's not to say that you can compare them numbers-wise. I think in your book, you cite that there's somewhere between 55 and 59, you know, enslaved Africans who were brought to Oregon versus the millions that there were in, you know, in other states and other southern states as well. But
4 million, right?
Yeah, 4 millions. Yeah. So in that sense, you know, you clearly can appreciate the difference in the numbers, but it doesn't change the perniciousness, the attitudes, the outright inability for Africans to make a life for themselves or live a dignified life of their own volition, which is, you know, enshrined in the U.S. Constitution. But let's see if I can find another one. Let's see. I'm wondering about free white labor. What does that mean? White men would get paid for their labor, or wouldn't they?
Free white men would, I'm sure free, I would assume, would be paid for their labor. Yeah. What am I missing? I'm missing something in the question there.
It might be, I think that's from Karen. If you want to elaborate on that, I'll be glad to follow up. But it just says, I'm wondering about free white labor. What does that mean? White men would get paid for their labor, wouldn't they?
Yeah, I just wondered, he mentioned that by having slaves in Oregon, it would keep free white labor from coming into Oregon. And I didn't understand why that, I didn't understand what that meant, because if they'd still need people to work, but they I guess free white labor meant free, not slaves. Is that what you meant by?
That's right. The idea would be, and this was an argument in many places, that blacks would be required to do the labor and they would be paid nothing because they were slaves. And therefore, there would not be jobs for the white person, free white labor. So that was an issue. And it became an issue in a number of places. But that was the argument that George Williams used to discourage the idea of slavery here. There would not be jobs for white men because blacks would be required to do them for free. Although nothing's really free, but that was the argument. Thank you for the question.
Yes, and
I see Rich Wanschneider on there asking a question. Rich, are you present here?
Sorry, I missed that. Could you say it again, please?
I think we have Siri asking questions now. Yeah, I see Rich Wanschneider there. Rich, are you able to?
Yeah, I think am I unmuted?
You're
unmuted. I was the one asking the question about Fletcher because in that Negro Cowboy book, the guy makes the argument, the authors make the argument that Worcester was a manifest destiny racist, and he basically erased blacks from the West, but they were there. And there were freed slaves and there were runaway slaves that were involved with the cattle drives. And it was, according to that book, it was a fairly egalitarian enterprise. And that, of course, was moving from south to north. And I don't know how much the Chisholm Trail and all that impacted Oregon, and whether that's where Fletcher came from, I don't know. But it just seems that in Eastern Oregon, in the cattle business, there were some blacks and half-breed Indians and whatnot that got involved. Molly Gloss deals a little bit with that in Jump Off Creek. And anyway, I think that even Eastern Oregon was more color varied historically than we acknowledge.
Thanks for that, Rich. Rich is my mentor, so it's good to have you there.
There's another question. Does your book touch on free black men like Reuben Crawford, who came to Oregon in 1870? He was a skilled craftsman of shipbuilding who belonged to the Oddfellows.
Sounds like a great story. I'm not familiar with that. I pretty much end my book with the end of the Civil War. And in the 13th and the 14th and the 15th Amendments and what happened to those over history.
We have a few raised hands here, and I want to get to those as well. Let me see. We have Growing Medicine Eagle. We'll go ahead and ask you to unmute.
Yes, as a Native American, need I say more? we got it the minute folks got onto this land. Anyway, I'm on the police review board and have been. I'm a advisor for city and state government, And I've served on the police review board, and I think I'm probably going to get back on. But recently, just this has been just a recent development. I live a few blocks from the Justice Center, where all the craziness is going on. Yay. And this is karma coming back to bite Portland in the you know what, in my opinion. But I support, of course, needless to say, we're supporting Black Lives Matter, and we're doing an awful lot. And it is up and out now. And the one thing about the police is 20 police left. They didn't get fired, they just left. And they left comments behind, and it pretty much addressed, well, why can't we just do policing like we've always done policing? Well, as we know, policing was formed by white supremacist KKK. And because of that, and a lot of people don't know that. And when I was on the police review board, we would vote. I had a vote. We would vote stressed out, ill-trained. We're not talking about bad people here. We're talking about ill-trained people that followed the same thing as it was formed. And it's absolutely targeting Black people, because that's how the police union in the whole country was formed.
Did you have a specific question that you wanted to ask? I appreciate all your comments. I just want to make sure that we got a question in there, because there's some other ones that I want to get to as well.
I'm the only person in the university. But do you, maybe not in this book, but are you going to, I think that needs to be addressed in one of your books, and people that are doing this kind of writing. I think we need to get very involved in present day situations and how we can change that. And that's part of what I'm doing here in downtown Portland, blocks from the Justice Center and on the boards, is we're trying to change, and we are changing that. By the way, that is changing, that's flipping as we speak.
Thank you so much. Greg, did you want to address that?
Yeah, well, I just say I do appreciate your comment, but my area of writing has sort of been on Oregon history and Western history. I've written several other books, Massacred for Gold, about the Chinese in the West, and about Peter Burnett. I've mentioned Peter Burnett in connection with Oregon. He went on to California and was the first governor down there, and tried to enact exclusion laws in California against Blacks, but failed. Where California's experience was much like Oregon's, in this period. And we've got another book coming out. I'm supposed to mention this. Take advantage of that question. This book is called Eminent Oregonians, if anybody can see it. It's coming out from Oregon State Press next year. I'm writing a section on Jesse Applegate, who played a role in discouraging slavery in Oregon. And several other people are writing. I've got Abigail Scott Dunway, Richard Newberger, Chief Joseph. And so this will be out next year, so watch for it. Thank you.
Great. We have another hand raised. I see it's Bernadette Janet.
Mute. Okay, there we go.
Thank you. I just wanted to know whether or not the cemetery where your ancestors were buried and the slaves that came across with them were buried, whether or not it was segregated or not.
I'm really glad you asked the question. Many cemeteries in this period were segregated, but Mount Union Cemetery, which was created by Reuben Shipley and his wife, who were a Black couple, was open to people of all races in that period, and still is today, as far as I know. I'm sure it must be, but that was part of the legacy of that particular cemetery.
And your ancestors are also buried there?
Some of them are, yes. Right.
Thank you.
Appreciate the question. That's a good one.
All right. There's one other question. What attempts, if any, have there been within Oregon to try and build a truth and reconciliation type of process to work at healing historical trauma or work toward reparations here in Oregon?
Well, it sounds like a good idea. But I know I have heard of no movement to do that. I would, I think you'd have to start with the legislature, find some favorable legislators down there who would be interested in furthering that, that position. I think, as I said earlier, I'd very much like to see some sort of memorial to the early Blacks that came out to Oregon, both slaves and free Blacks who came out in that period. I just think that there really does need to be some recognition for them. Washington has done much better with their history than Oregon has.
And I also believe that it begins with the pedagogy. I think that in general, the mythology you refer to about our shared history needs to be resolved in a way that we can all honor that history and all appreciate that history. And it's not something that's practiced in the United States all that much. We're famous for our short memories. I want to make sure that we are within our time allotment here. Carla or Donna, are we okay, or can we take additional questions? Or
I think we can begin to wind it down, but certainly it's not a hard stop. So as long as you and Mr. Nokes have time, but we should begin to wind it down.
Okay. I think there are a few follow-up questions here. Hang on one moment. This is me trying to interpret the chat bar and the raised hands at the same time.
It might be a good time to, really thank Mr. Nokes, and for those who do have to leave by, about approximately this time, and those who want to stay can stay. It's just been wonderful to hear from him, and very much appreciated.
Indeed, thank you so much, Greg, for all of your research and your work in this area. It's certainly something that we can all learn from.
Well, thank you very much. And I appreciate everybody's interest, and I appreciate your kindness in facilitating this, Malik. Great questions.
My pleasure. It's been my pleasure.
All the way from Maui, too, we're talking. Huh?
Correct.
Good place.
Yeah, can't beat it. Can't beat it.
Last call for questions, everyone.
I think Marianne Steffel-Wallace had a question, if she's still there.
Yeah, I'm still here. I was just gonna say, wouldn't education be the place to start? I mean, I work at Portland Community College. I just feel like the place to start to make these reparations. I think it's right in line with the Black Lives Matter movement about everybody owning their history, including Oregon, or, really owning their history, so that we can see a critical mass of white people dismantling these systems. Wouldn't that, I just think that's where it would be. I don't know if that's what you would think.
I have no strong opinions on it, but it makes sense.
I mean, it's going to be hard work. I'm not saying it's going to just suddenly be wave the magic wand, it goes away. It's going to be lifelong work. That was just my questions. I think it's a change.
Well, thank you. This has been a great audience. I thank everybody for being here with your good questions and helping me, or being patient as I struggled through the early slides, trying to figure all that out. But
you and me both, Greg.
Thank you. Good.
Well, again, thank you to Take Part Portland Anti-Racism Team. Thank you to the Spiritual Assembly of the Baha'is of Portland. And thank you to our speaker, Greg Nokes. Wonderful book again. It's been in the toolbar a number of times, but the book can be purchased online, as well as, I imagine, any bookstores there in Portland, particularly
any bookstore throughout the state, as far as I know. This was a nominee for the Oregon Book Award in 2013. I think we mentioned that. And I know it's carried by Sun River Books and Sun River and Powell's and all the bookstores in Portland and Eastern Oregon and the Dalles and Pendleton. And so I think you can get it. And if the bookstore doesn't have it, they can certainly order it. That's the other part of it, so.
And again, we look forward to your upcoming work here. Again, what's the name of that book that's coming out? Eminent Oregonians. And it's being put together by Steve Forrester, who's editor of the Daily Astorian, and being published by Oregon State University with Press, which publishes all of my books. You can find out more. You want to go to my website, gregnokes.com. There's a lot more information there on the books. Fantastic. Well, we certainly appreciate it. And from the midmost heart of the Pacific Ocean, I bid you all good night. Good. And thank you. Thank you so much for having me. Thanks.
Mahalo and thank you.
And thank you so much, everyone, for joining us this evening. This was a wonderful event. We appreciate all of your attendance and your participation. We will be taking December off from our events, so we will see you again in January. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Greg.
Thank you, Donna, and all the folks at PART for putting this together. Hey, Steve, how are you?
Good.
Good to see you.
Thanks.
Thanks for being here. Take
Wonderful.
care.
Thank you very much.
All right. Bye.
Bye.
Steve Harris was there. Yeah.
What a great presentation.
Well, thank
you.
you.
It was wonderful. I was riveted.
Could I ask one question?
Of course.
You mentioned before that you tried to get your book into the schools and were not successful. Do you think this would be a good time to try again when the climate is a little better?
I would, yeah, I wouldn't know how to do it. There's a committee, the name of which I have forgotten. With about, we'll have a dozen people. We met informally, and therefore improving education with an eye to more social justice issues. I'm embarrassed I can't remember the name right now, but after about 4 or 5 meetings of going nowhere, and I'm interested in writing books, not talking about books which aren't going anywhere. So I just dropped it, but nothing has happened. But it really needs somebody to take charge, somebody in position with influence to take charge, because I think it should be in schools. And I know, like I said, a number of school teachers have picked up the book at book events and said this will be perfect for our class, both in high school and even in college as well, because so few people know this story. So it does need to be out there. The timing is good. There's suddenly a lot of interest in, more interest in the book as reflected here today. So we'll see what happens. I'll push it in any way I can.
How long ago was it that you tried?
This would have been in 2016, 17, in that period.
Not that long ago.
Not that long ago. No, the book came out in 2013, so it's still, you know, a lot of people are just discovering it.
You went and spoke also
So,
in class.
Greg?
Yeah, I've talked to a number of classes. Hey, Rich.
Yeah, I was just thinking, we did a brown bag with Pearl Marsh, and Pearl Marsh has written a book about Maxville, the Black community, logging community here.
Right, great story.
And her brother, actually Amos Marsh, graduated from high school in Wallowa in 1956 and then played at Oregon State and ran track there, and then played for the Cowboys, our only professional athlete out of, and her father was one of the black loggers at Maxville. But what you pick up in that book is the importance of the black railroad community. That there was a black railroad community in LeGrand. People came there working with the railroad. I once picked up a black hitchhiker in LeGrand. This was 25, 30 years ago. And he said he'd been at a family reunion and they didn't expect him at this family reunion. But he was from Salt Lake City and he was a black railroad family. So railroads, and then what we also learned is that 25% of the logging community in the early teens and 20s in the United States was black. And as they finished the trees in the South, they came across to Arizona and to other places. And eventually some of them came to Oregon. Anyway, the railroad community, and the railroads tied in with logging too. So that's all, it's later than your primary period of interest, but that connection of the logging communities and I think Vernonia also imported some black loggers, as I recall.
Good input. Thanks, Rich. And as far as everything went today, I was glad to hear it too.
Yeah. Yeah.
One more question.
Sure.
My reading tells me that somewhere around 2002, 2003, the racist language was removed from the Constitution. I don't know if you recall that.
Yeah, Mark Hatfield was behind that. I think it was earlier than that, if I'm not mistaken. After Mark Hatfield became in the legislature and then a governor, one of his priorities was to clean up the language from the Constitution. So he was behind that.
But the vote that I recall is that 30% of Oregonians were against removing it. Do you recall that?
I don't recall that. I
just don't know. I don't remember where I read this is the only problem, but.
Yeah, and that being the case, I mean, it speaks to a lot of the deep-seated racism in Oregon, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Well,
I don't know that that's a fact, but if it's true, like you say, I mean, that speaks to.
Well, I think there is still a lot of deep-seated racism. And, you know, Isabel Wilkerson is writing about caste, and it's about whether or not you stay in your place. And clearly Oregon's intent was to make sure Blacks knew this wasn't their case. And I moved here in 2000. And what was strange to me was amongst white professional women, several times I was asked, how did it feel to live in the whitest city in the United States? And I said, I've lived in Seattle, I've lived in Anchorage, Alaska, you know, it's no big deal. And they were like, but no, we are the whitest major city. It was like a source of pride amongst professional people in the years 2000 to 2004. And I just had trouble with, why are you proud of this? And amongst other people in the Black community, I've had this discussion where they see it as people who are proud to be a white community still. And I think more importantly, that there's a point about being difficult for Black professionals to stay in Oregon because it's a hostile environment, and to this day. So I think that the legacy of whites only continues to sort of permeate in a way that makes it difficult for people to want to remain. There doesn't have to be a law on the books if you're made to feel unwelcome.
I have no doubt that what you're saying is true. Yes.
So
yeah.
Anyway, well,
it will change.
Well, hopefully. I mean, there's more interest at least in changing now.
Yeah, a lot of change going on these days. Yeah.
But I want to thank you for your book because that helps to create the change and the awareness that needs to happen.
Well, thank you very much. And what's your name again?
Bernadette Janae.
Thank you, Bernadette. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Have a nice evening.
You too. Thanks.
Bye.
Okay, I think we can wrap it up.
Wrap it up. Thank you very much, Donna. Appreciate all your help.
Greg, we are so thrilled that you came and did this. We are immensely grateful. It was absolutely wonderful. Thank you.
I now know what PART is. I had no idea before, but you sound like a great organization for everything I read about you. So got a great participation tonight. 76 people there. That's pretty good.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. Very nice. Yeah.
And you held them.
So much,
Thank you for having me.
Yes, you held them. And Malik was fabulous. Oh, he was.
Yes, he was.